everybody, I'm Pastor AJ Houseman, and welcome to 10-Foot Pole, a podcast dig deeper into aspects of the Bible that get glossed over or totally ignored in most preaching. The Bible has a lot of parts that are racy, uncomfortable, and sometimes downright horrifying. Let's talk about it. Hey, welcome to Season 3, Episode 5. Hope you had a good week off last week. I certainly had a great week in Scotland, test tasting scotch and going golfing and doing fun things like that. Today, our guest is Pastor Brad Fuerst, who is the pastor at Lumen Austin, which is the Lutheran campus ministry at the University of Texas in Austin. Do you have other campuses that you also service is not the right word?
Yeah. That we serve. Yeah, we try. We've Austin Community College and St. Edward's. We try and broadcast that, but man, when you're working with 50,000 students, it is hard to break away.
Yeah.
I hate to say that, but for those schools I've named, it's mostly a attractional model. So yeah, I'm not going there.
Hey, but if you're open, like if they show up, they're going to be treated equally.
Yeah.
That's what counts.
Yeah, absolutely. All are welcome.
Yeah, feel that. So thanks, Pastor Brad, for joining us. So this is Pastor Brad's second appearance on the podcast. Pastor Brad's first appearance was early, episode 5 in season 1. We were just getting started, and it was great. And I always appreciate your wisdom and also just like your humor and who you are as a person. So I appreciate you coming and joining us.
So basically, it took you 2 years to warm up the idea of having me back on again.
Yeah, that's exactly what I just said. Just kidding. Gotta expand the horizons a little bit. There's so many good pastors to talk to.
True, there are.
You are also one of them. So today, Pastor Brad and I are going to catch up with Jesus again. That, kind of almost where we left off a couple weeks ago, except, we missed a story in the middle. But it's still, Jesus is, still in Jerusalem now. He's already come in on the donkey, and he is continuing to fight with the Pharisees and other church leaders. And that's exactly where we meet him again. So we're going to talk about Matthew 22, verses 15 to 22, which is the gospel lesson for Sunday, October 22nd, 2023. If you plan to go to church that Sunday, this is what you will probably hear. So I think some things about this story. So what's interesting is, so this story is the exact same in all 3 synoptic gospels, meaning the ones that follow, we've talked about this on the podcast before, that Matthew, Mark, and Luke basically tell the same, story and timeline, and that the Gospel of John is out in left field, wanted to tell a totally different story. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke are telling the same story. Like it's the same, like almost word for word, the story. So that means that, the Gospel of Mark was written first, and that means that the authors of the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, who would have had access to the Gospel of Mark when writing theirs, didn't think they needed to add anything. Nothing needed further explaining that. We should just get it from this first version that Mark wrote down. So they're all the same. So presumably we hear this once a year.
They are.
I didn't look up that part.
Presumably, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it would be. I didn't either, but boy, it's certainly helpful to have the reminder, especially given the rise of Christian nationalism.
There's so much going on in this. I think we just got to read it, and then there's a lot. There's certainly a lot happening.
Yeah.
So I'm going to read it. It's, again, Matthew 22, verses 15 to 22. And I'm going to read the New Revised Standard Version Updated Edition, which is mildly slightly different from the New Revised Standard Version, but a couple of words. This one says Cesar rather than emperor. Okay. Then the Pharisees went and plotted to entrap him in what he said, him being Jesus. So they sent their disciples to him along with the Herodians, saying, "Teacher, we know that you are sincere and teach the way of God in accordance with truth and show deference to no one, for you do not regard people with partiality. Tell us then, what do you think? Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not?" But Jesus, aware of their malice, said, "Why are you putting me to the test, you hypocrites? Show me the coin used for the tax." And they brought him a denarius. Then he said to them, "Whose head is this, and whose title?" They answered, "Caesar's." Then he said to them, "Give therefore to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." When they heard this, they were amazed, and they left him and went away. The gospel of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Praise to you, O Christ.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. All right. What's the first thing that, like, when you read this, what's your like first reaction? What steps out to you a lot?
Oh my goodness, they ooze with flattery,
Well, that, yeah.
right? The religious authorities are like they're they're they are just piling it on.
Mm-hmm.
They call him teacher. Presumably that would be rabbi, right?
Yeah.
So the Pharisees have just called this homeless Jew from Nazareth rabbi.
Yeah.
So you already know they're full of shit.
Yep.
And then showing deference and you speak the truth. I mean, they really are brown nosers at this point.
Yeah.
Yeah. What about you?
Well, what gets me is it's the setting up of the question, right? So the thing that, so they say, you are sincere and you teach the way of God in accordance to the truth, right? And so it's the thing where like they're trying to catch him. It says right here that they're plotted to entrap him, right? They're trying to get him between a rock and a hard place, that no matter what he says, it's gonna get himself in trouble.
Yeah. It's the only time that word is used. It's a paradousein
Yes.
in Greek, to trap, to hunt down and trap.
It's a hunting term, yeah.
Yes, it is, because you feel threatened.
Yes.
Many times,
right? Like that's the thing. Like it's meant to be aggressive. Like this is how they're coming at him. Like it is an aggressive word on purpose.
Yep.
And so another thing I think for me that really is interesting is so the fact that it's the Pharisees along with the Herodians that are coming together to do this, to try to trap him. And the reason that's odd, just so bring our audience along here. First of all, the audience, if you want to learn more about the Herodian dynasty and folks that would have like followed them, please go back and listen to, what episode is it? It's season 1, episode 14, with Matt Folcomer Leonard. We talk a lot about all the Herods and the dynasty, and so something is interesting. So the Herodian dynasty, they are indeed Jewish, of a different class set, right? Like they're the ones that are, as just said, like they're in charge. They're this dynasty, right? And so they're in favor of Rome because Rome is giving them this power. And so we have these opposite sort of people, like they wouldn't agree on anything except for that they hate Jesus. So
right.
So like the Herodians would want to pay taxes, that benefits them. They want Jesus to say that that's a good thing. Whereas the Pharisees, these church leaders, would want to say that that's a bad thing, because the whole thing is this is a tax that is imposed on folks that are conquered. So this occupation of Israel, like they're really the Jews are really against that, right? Like this is they hate it, right? So this idea that they have to pay a tax because they have been conquered, that they are occupied. And so I think that they're hoping that if Jesus is in favor of not paying the taxes, right, like that could get him arrested and in trouble, right? Plotting, sedition against the empire. Whereas if Jesus is in favor of taxes, then they think he's going to lose a lot of followers because no one would like that answer.
That would totally discredit him.
Exactly. So this is the rock in the hard place that they're trying to catch him in.
Yeah. No prophet is going to say, yeah, it's cool to pay taxes to Caesar.
Right.
So he's basically taken himself out of contention of being a prophet. So, yeah, I mean, he's between a rock and a hard place. And I think that what's funny to me is that when he goes to say, okay, well, show me the coin.
Yep.
and then these two strange bedfellows, the prophets, or the Pharisees and the Herodians, they're able to produce it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so they've got it in their pocket. So presumably Jesus does not. So already you can see that who is in possession of the coinage used for taxing?
Money. Yeah,
It's the religious authorities and the Herodians.
So I think that that's really what it's about for a couple reasons. So my understanding is that actually so the assumption I think here is that they're still in the temple, right? Jesus had cleansed the temple, now he's in the temple teaching, they're coming and doing the questioning thing. So they're in the temple. My understanding is it would have been taboo to have that coin in the temple.
Well, yes, because of the
you're not
second commandment. Right?
Yes, it would be breaking a commandment to have that coin because it has Caesar's head on it in the temple. So you think you're asking, well, what money do they give in the temple? Because they give money. There's actually like a currency exchanger outside the temple that you would exchange your Roman Empire coins into temple coins in order to give them to the church that way, because it would have been against the religion to have that coin in there. So
to the temple,
which one of these Jews has a taboo coin inside the temple?
We know it's either the Pharisees or the Herodians. We know it's not Jesus.
Exactly. That I mean, though, also presumably Jesus probably doesn't have any money.
Right.
So he couldn't have made that.
Yeah, right. But so the thing, just to go back to the second commandment, this is that you don't make any graven image, right? So to just have, even Herod knew this, the coinage that Herod put forth did not have an image of Herod on there. But this is likely at the time of it is Tiberius Caesar, I believe.
Yeah.
And Tiberius Caesar, the coinage that we have from there, the denarii would have had his, the profile picture, and then it would have said Caesar, son of God, or the divine.
Yep. That made him basically a divinity.
Right.
So the fact that
this is their pocket change.
So this coin also would have been like about a day's wage, is my understanding. The average person, it would have been about 1 day's wage. So for them to just be walking around with like these coins is just, I think there's more to be said there about how Jesus calls them out in this moment of producing the coins than maybe in like this statement, that we get later that gets used so much, right? Like, what is in this message from Jesus to them by merely asking them to produce this coin, which they do and can on demand?
Yeah, it discredits them already.
Oh yeah, easily.
Well, so we kind of know that the Gospel of Matthew, most biblical scholarship says this is specifically written for a Jewish Christian ecclesia. Okay, so pretty much all the hearers have gone through their bar and bar mitzvahs, and they know the 10 Commandments forwards and backwards, and would already be scandalized to see these who are supposed to be, especially the Pharisees, who are trying to make, we got to be careful with I say religious authorities, because I think that maybe helps us steer away from any sort of anti-Semitic thing going on here or interpretation. The Pharisees are really, their agenda is to try and help the Jewish people to be a faithful, holy populace, and that they see the covenantal law as a way of living into that, or actualizing that. And if you're like someone who's gone through your bat mitzvah and you see your religious authority so readily able to produce these idolatrous
Yeah.
this idolatrous coinage, it's scandalizing. So
Yeah,
yeah.
you're right, and I think that that would have been very, very obvious to the original audience of that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So then we get into the thing that Jesus says. So what does he say? Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and give to God what is God's.
Mm-hmm.
This, okay. So I want to talk a little bit more about this in sort of the ancient languages and talk about what clearly this is. But first, I would like to talk about the interpretations of this statement and how it has influenced the Christian church throughout history.
Mm.
Do you have
Okay.
any? Well, so
you
go.
begin with the sovereign. This is said to a folk who dwell under the rule of an oppressive regime.
Mm-hmm.
And so the original Sitz im Leben, the original setting in life, is that that statement it's a hopeful statement. Okay, that yeah, we'll give back to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, but if you roll that back a bit, Caesar doesn't come by anything, not the metal to make the coinage, not anything without first there being this creator God who created the heavens and the earth. So therein lies the hope, that while the regime may use that tax for the purpose of more evil things and deeds, there is a God greater than that who's is the Alpha and the Omega.
Yeah.
And all things, that arc will bend towards good, despite what kingdoms will rise and fall. So it is a hopeful statement.
Yeah. It is. So so the thing about the word here that it says, well, Jesus says, well, whose head is on it, is what I read. The word there, it's actually whose likeness. And this word likeness that we have here is the one that's used in the Greek Septuagint in Genesis 1, where God created them. God created the humans in our image, our likeness, right? So it's the same term that's used. So if you read it that way, so give to Caesar what's in Caesar's likeness, and give to God what is in God's likeness. It's very clear that Jesus is pointing to this, what's created in God's likeness, right? That it's us. And so to me, there's an incredibly freeing and redemptive statement in what he says. Sure, the money might be Caesar's, but you belong to God, not to the empire. And that, I think, is the subversive thing that's in here that gets often missed. It gets lost in translation, I think. And I think that's the thing in here is I think Jesus is giving a seditious statement, right? And even one step further, right? If we think about what you said and sort of this everything, God created the heavens and the earth, and everything, the earth is the Lord's and all that is in it, the world and all the people in here, you got Psalm 24 and that just yes, right? That there is no I think sometimes people try to use this as sort of this idea of like the two kingdoms. And I don't think that that's what Jesus is doing here.
No, and it doesn't really that Luther idea of the two kingdoms interpretation would preach definitely for countries like, say, Ukraine, Russia, but in countries that are not dwelling, and I don't think Ukraine is a failed state. I wager that Russia might be. But in those situations, we might be able to deploy Luther's two kingdoms and derive some hope and promise from that. But I think in this situation, what he is offering, as I originally said, is hope, and it reminds me of this prayer, this offering prayer that we sometimes, well, I should say that's probably in the Lutheran liturgy somewhere. Merciful God, we give you thanks for what you have first given us,
Mm-hmm.
ourselves, our time, and our possessions, signs of your
Signs of your
gracious
gracious
love.
love. Mm-hmm.
Receive them for the sake of him who offered himself for us, Jesus Christ, blah, blah. Amen. But
The blah blah wasn't in
statement
my copy, but you know.
but that's a statement that all that we are and all that we have is
Yeah.
comes from God.
Yeah.
And that, the emperor or Caesar represents let's be clear, a very um temporal realm
Mm-hmm.
that comes and goes. Last time I checked, we're no longer using the coinage from Caesar Tiberius's rule to pay our taxes. That time is done, and it's pretty much worthless when it comes to satisfying Uncle Sam.
Right. And like so much past the fall of the Roman Empire, right? Like it's yeah. So one thing when I was looking at the different ways, I always like to read from a bunch of different theological perspectives on what, they would talk about in their churches. And so one of the fascinating things that I usually do is I'll select, a nice Southern Baptist or some other kind of evangelical or a couple of them and read how does this preach? What are they telling people? Because you and I, when we talk about the Lutheran setting, we don't talk about money, right? Like that's not the primary focus of what we talk about. We talk about what, this hope, this thing, we focus on like, you are God's. What is God's? The earth and all of creation and everything, right? And so especially in the current sort of political climate, and from some more conservative evangelical perspectives, we're in a huge culture war right now, and it comes down to our government and who's leading it and who's on the right side of Christianity, stuff. And so I found some fascinating things. So like, first of all, one of the things that gets talked about is this idea of money and what does it mean to pay taxes, and that's exactly what Jesus is supporting. Jesus says, pay your taxes, right? Like that's and is advocating, they use this as a place to really pinpoint where Jesus advocates the separation of church and state. That's one perspective. I'm going to go down a road to why that's not at all what Jesus is talking about. And two, the other perspective is about that Jesus is saying to fully submit to both government and God.
Okay.
So those are perspectives that people use and preach on and teach on out of this passage, which are very, very, very problematic for a couple of reasons. Let's talk about the separation of church and state. I think that you and I have done a great job so far of already kind of laying out why that's not what Jesus is talking about here. Right? Is, he uses this term of coinage to kind of call them out on their wealth and power and their own hypocrisy. And at the same time, claiming that we are all God's and that we belong to God's and everything actually belongs to God. And then it doesn't really work that way.
Right.
And giving that, sort of freedom. And I think another thing that really stands out to me where I would say that that's not what Jesus is talking about is when you take this in the larger perspective of the whole thing, nowhere does Jesus actually, I think everything that Jesus does is fighting so much against the political system and against the government, and almost everything he does, it doesn't make sense to view it that way.
No, it doesn't, because there are a variety of situations where you would not want to say, hey, let's serve God and state or God and country. Because as I mentioned before, if your country is a failed state, then just sort of subscribing to that, just saying, okay, well, let's just throw up our hands and we'll just regard both sort of equally, sort of makes you complicit in the oppressive and violent realities of that failed state.
Mm-hmm.
So it can't be dichotomous. So well, then what do? Do you say then I'm going to it's a failed state, so let me say I'm going to figure out just how much of my taxes are go towards that violence and that oppression, and I'll shave that off of my tax, okay, and give the remainder, and then that way I'm doing a good thing there. I'm showing that I am faithful to God. But that's not a good answer either, because then you sort of recoil from the hope that God can get God's way with even hardened hearts. It's really it's a conundrum.
I mean, not even in a failed state situation. I just think about how we approach sort of idea of sort of like following in Jesus' footsteps, of sort of being the hands and feet of God, of wanting to manifest this kingdom on earth. This is more of a, Johannine approach to it. So I'm melding gospels, right? But like, if this is sort of like our goal and our thing that we do, I think a part of that is like government is a tool within that. And I do think part of where Jesus is exposing the flaws in the system isn't that he's saying there should be no system. It's that the system is unjust. And so for us to follow faithfully in following Jesus' commandment to love God and to love others, and how does that fit into this system, is to advocate within the system by way of our faith.
Right. To speak up.
Yeah.
To darken the halls of power. Go ahead, pay your taxes. Political parties will rise and fall. Legislation will rise and fall. Decisions, Supreme Court decisions will, yes, they will rise and they will fall, as we have seen. But what that means then is that that you as a follower of the way, while you may pay your taxes, the most important thing that you have to offer is what Jesus Christ offered, is presence in the dark places, advocacy, accompaniment. That's the currency that Christ is dealing in.
Yeah.
It's the currency, it's the greatest currency that God has given us, as we have been imprinted with God's image.
Relationships.
Yeah, well, and we are the coinage of God. I hate to reduce us down to in a monetary sense, right?
Well,
but we have God's imprint on us, and we are the ones who have been so loved by God that we are now freed to go out into the world, to the hard places, to the hungry places, to the wounded places.
Yeah.
And to enact God's kingdom, the one that we pray for Sunday in and Sunday out, right?
A children's sermon about this text that I have heard talked about is, to kind of like pass around coins and talk about who's on them and what it means and blah, blah, blah. And then to have like this box that they can't see yet, and like inside here is God's most precious currency. Like this, it's very precious. And then you let the kids get all excited about it, and then you open the lid to let them look in it, and it's a mirror.
Yeah. That's a good one.
I can't take credit for that. I read that somewhere.
Well, it is a good one, though. Kudos to the pastor who came up with that one.
Yeah. And so I think like that's the thing is like, if
I should say, like, wait, can I gotta correct myself.
You do it.
That was a very clerical centered statement. Kudos to the minister, deacon, or Sunday school teacher, or it could have been a pastor who came up with that children's sermon.
I appreciate that.
So.
I think it was a pastor, but I at least that's who's
Still,
blocked. Yeah.
let's get rid of the default, the clerical default there.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. So, like I said, so another way that this gets preached on is this idea of total submission to the government, to the powers that be, to the empire, which I also don't believe is what Jesus is advocating here in any way, shape, or form. If anything, I think he's kind of saying the opposite. But he's saying it in a way that makes them look foolish. I think that's the whole point. Right. Which again, like, let's look at the totality of Jesus's life. And he's not doing that.
No, he never does that. Well, they said it at the very, very beginning. You show deference to no one.
Yeah.
He's not showing deference to the emperor. He's not showing deference to the Pharisees, nor to the Herodians. The deference is to the reign of God, and what that looks like. That good news is going to be proclaimed to the poor, release to the captives, sight to the blind, and freedom to the oppressed. And this is
and he does that to the Jews and the non-Jews alike.
Yeah,
right? Like that's
his life is devoted. His entire being is devoted to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. How have you so have you heard people use this as any way, shape, or form of sort of a justification for either pro or against government?
Well, I think that it's I worry how it's being used in by folks who are gravitate towards Christian nationalism.
Well, you hear that, like you hear it, like that's like
Yeah.
a common phrase that you hear tossed around: "Render unto Caesar's what is Caesar's."
Yeah, and unfortunately, what ends up happening there is that you again are equating God's mission and enterprise with your national identity, and that it is the country that's going to enact and is responsible for enacting God's kingdom. And so, and then what's even more dangerous is that when you combine that with sort of bigoted, narrow views of who is in and who is out in God, under God's reign, then there are definitely losers.
Yeah.
And you're turning loose if Christian nationalism has its way, it's turning loose a country on a world that is longing for love and longing for hope, and the folks who are dwell within the margins. I think in particular the LGBTQIA community, women and women's bodies, and our BIPOC and API and indigenous siblings are all do not fall so much into the Christian, at least the Christian nationalism that is being lived out in this land.
Have you seen the Shiny Happy People documentary yet?
No, I have not.
It's on Amazon Prime. So it primarily focuses on the Duggars, but it goes deeper than that and focuses on the particular religion that the Duggars are a part of, and the just kind of the, I don't like to say this word, but like the crazy cult-like things that are being taught. And it talks about other like sects and shoot-offs and other things, but it really like hyper draws into this part of Christianity in the United States that is so far down this rabbit hole. And no one really took it seriously, but we're now starting to see the fruits of all their labors of literally brainwashing a generation from birth into particular ideals and mindsets. And now they're adults entering politics and doing things like that. And like a slow kind of like takeover of the country, and we're now reaping the benefits, if you can call them that,
Yeah.
of this particular generation of people that have been homeschooled and brought up in certain ways, and were allowed to teach curriculums that actually are like contrary to fact.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
that's totally, legal and okay, and you can do that in the United States. And now we have a whole population of people whose mindset is so contrary to reality that there's no conversation to be had. And so
Right.
one of the things I did read came out of this church. And so the way that they would use this is to talk about that, like, to use the government. And that's, I don't know. It's keeping me up at night still a little bit sometimes to think
Yeah.
about this version of Christianity and the way that Jesus's words have been warped so much.
Right. So if you go back then, and it's very easy, I think, in this time to live in fear or like just become depressed and struggle to hold on to hope. But then I go back to the beginning of this text, and I think about these Herodians who are not. I mean, as a political power or a political party, there's some parallel between, say, other groups that live, other factions that exist now. I mean, maybe their motto, Herodians, was to make a Judah great again.
Hmm.
And you see that, when you see the enterprise of the Herodian dynasty and how it ended up, well, it's no longer got free range in this world. It's an ancient. It's something relegated to antiquity. Those things, when you look at the ebb and flow of human history, those things have risen and fallen throughout history, right? And so there will be a tale that will be told, a history of Christian nationalism that is not going to bode well for these groups, that God gets God's way in the end.
Mm-hmm.
The arc is towards good. And so Christ is always and ever wooing us back to that. I think Christ is wooing us back to that in this text.
Yeah.
To say that you do not. I'm not going to give hope even on you, religious authorities and Herodians. I'm going to remind you that all that we are and all that we have is God's, that we have been imprinted by God's image.
Mm-hmm.
And that we are called and live in such a way that renders all of it to God. Let the emperor have their little itty bitty coinage.
Mm-hmm.
The God gets all of us.
Yeah.
That's why I think they have to turn away in silence. Maybe they turn around and think about it for a while.
Well, I think he also kind of basically called them out too, right? Like,
yeah, right.
Calling them at their own question, right? It's not about, is this lawful or not? It's about remembering who you are, whose you are.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the part that I think, well, to me, it reminds me of things that we can get caught up in the church, right? Like we can get caught up in really little things, right? Like fighting about where the flag is in the sanctuary, or who sits on something, what we wear, who's right. All these little things, or what age should people get to have communion? I think that's a big one right now, actually happening in Lutheran churches, right? Like we get, which by the way, it's ridiculous because there's no biblical thing that says, oh, they have to be 11 and have to take a class, right? Like it's all the things that we make up, right? So it's all these little things. And this is what this really feels like. It's this kind of argument that's happening, and they're trying to call him out, right, so that they can get him in trouble. And he's like, listen, guys, you're not asking the right question, right? Like you're not focusing on what's really important. What's really important is that look around you. Every single one of these people is beloved by God. that this beautiful scenery that you can see is God's, that the stones that build this temple is God's,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm. And
And what
AJ,
are we supposed to be
yeah,
doing with it?
right. AJ, I think that we can sometimes take an episode like this and think that there is just this antagonism between Jesus and the Pharisees and the Herodians, or anyone who's going to take him to task and try and trap him. But I do think this is not that. I think that when we hear our Christ talking and responding, he may have used the word hypocrites, but he is trying to get them back. He's trying to woo them back.
Yeah.
And I mean, yeah, we know how the story will end. But we also know that there were people that were really people that were transformed by this homeless Jew from Nazareth because of the things he taught. And isn't it possible? So the reason I raise this up is because of the dearth of civil discourse in our world right now. That we are not listening to each other. We have dug in our heels, and we are not responding wisely the way that Christ would want us to. The reason that we can rattle off proclaiming good news to the poor, sight to the blind, freedom to the oppressed, that kind of stuff, that is so central to what Jesus came to proclaim according to the Gospel of Luke, right? And it is really the appearance of what God's reign looks like. And so we, as proclaimers of the good news of Jesus Christ, we're called to do that not just from the pulpit, but we're called to do that when Thanksgiving comes. And there's debates on, maybe you have, I'm thinking about the Saturday Night Live episode or scene where they're all at the table. It's with Matt Damon and Cecily Strong. You remember, it's like, I don't know if you remember this. It was a horrible Christmas day, and they're all at the table. And here is one of the family members wearing a MAGA hat. And
I didn't see this one.
You didn't see, did you?
No.
Oh my gosh. It just, everything falls apart at that dinner table. And it's just one episode. Like, they're looking back through that. You have to just YouTube this, you search it.
Okay.
But Matt Damon, Cecily Strong. Okay. In any case, Cecily gets called, tells this family member to remove his hat, and he goes, "You're racist." And there's this vitriol that's at the table, and that, I don't think, is really what that's not, at least for the ones who endeavor to follow Jesus, it's not the way that Christ is encouraging. Right? We're called to see the likeness that our neighbors have been created in, and to have civil discourse, and to speak the truth in love, not to write people off. I don't think he's writing the Pharisees and the Herodians off. He answers their question.
Yeah, I don't think he's writing. It's not that I think he's writing them off. It's that I think that, like, he's drawing to the point that, like, it's not about money.
Right. Thanks. Yeah. Thanks for getting us back to that. It's not about money. It's about everything, about all of us, all that we are and all that we have.
Yeah.
I guess I went a little bit far afield there. I usually do.
You're not going a little far afield. I think these are all things to expound upon.
The civil I guess I read, maybe I'm doing some eisegeting here when I say that that I'm reading civil discourse into this episode, and that's something that I'm really concerned about.
I don't think you are reading it in. I think that it's 100% there, and right. So that's part of this last day this last week, and these arguments that he's having in the temple with them is exactly that. It's about this wedge that's in society, and specifically, like, why it's important here that the Pharisees and the Herodians are together, because they don't agree on anything. They're on far opposite sides of the field of stuff, right?
Yeah,
and so the fact that the only thing that they can agree on is that they don't like this guy, I think that's very much to the point, right? And if they're trying to talk about, well, what's the best for our society, or trying to catch him in some kind of a political thing to call him out, I don't think that that's too far flung at all. I also think that's right on par. And one of the reasons I have this podcast is because I think there's pastors everywhere that are so careful these days about what they say from the pulpit, because someone on the opposite side of the political spectrum is going to get mad at them. And my thing is if you're preaching the words of Jesus, let them get mad at you.
Yeah.
Jesus wasn't a Republican or a Democrat. Jesus didn't like the whole system. Right? And that's the game that he's not playing with them right here. I think that's exactly the point.
Well, good. Thanks, AJ.
I was just articulating what was going on in your brain when you brought that up, right? Like that's
no. So yeah, back to my point is that we in our spheres of influence, we are called to occupy those difficult places where we point to Christ and we point to what is at base for all of us, is that we have been created and loved by God, and that does not know political line, that doesn't know a national line or boundary. That is all encompassing. And when it is all encompassing, then I think that there's opportunity for hope and transformation and good, fruitful conversation.
Yeah.
That might move the dial a bit.
I find that both incredibly comforting, and I hear it as a challenge, right? Because it's just that we have to try to talk to and work with people that we don't agree with, right? That if our job is to further this kingdom, it means we have to enter those spheres, that we can't just sit under a rock and do nothing, right? And that's another thing that I hear here, if it's give what to Caesar's, what is Caesar's, and give to God what is God's, right? So if we have to give to our society what we owe, I would say part of that is being a educated, competent, and compassionate citizen in the face of everything that is happening in our world. And what is our role as our duty as voters, and to what does it mean, right? Like those are things, that's what we owe our society, right? And so part of that is, I think it's incredibly important that we do come ready and arms, not armed is not the word I want to use, but like equipped with what Jesus is teaching and what it means for us to be followers and to render what is God's.
Yep. Pay your taxes and also stay engaged.
Yeah, vote.
Stay engaged. Exactly. Not just vote, but to do what the 3 bishops here in Texas did. In writing an open letter to
what happened?
Writing an open letter to our governor right now, who has got a razor barrier in the Rio Grande. That has already taken the lives of 3 or 4 folks now. 3 or 4 Imago Dei bearers, image of God bearers, who were seeking something, running from something to have a life, got caught up in the razor wire float that was put in the Rio Grande. And our bishops, Bishops Gronberg, Breiner, and Reinert, sent a letter to Governor Abbott rebuking that. Say that is an evil, that thing is an evil thing.
Yeah.
So I mean, those, and they pay their taxes.
Right. Well, it's also to say too is this idea of remembering to render what is God's, and as we follow Jesus' teaching and stuff, it's not an advocation for nationalism, and it's not being a patriot. That is not what Jesus teaches, that for some reason our nation is above the laws and the will of God. What you said actually really reminded me of it's something I still think about a lot. Pretty much anytime something like this happens is, I don't remember what year it was, but the Orlando nightclub shooting.
Yeah.
The following that, presiding Bishop Eaton, so the big head honcho bishop of the Lutheran Church, Bishop Eaton said, in the minds of this gunman, the LGBT folks in this nightclub were somehow severed from our common humanity in the image of God.
Mm-hmm.
And those words just like stick with me, because every time and any time that we do something like that, that we make those decisions, it's just that you're forgetting that those people too are created in the image of God.
Yeah.
And so
Yes.
therefore, what does it mean as our calling to them? How should we treat them? How should we act?
Yeah.
And there's no way that you can convince me that killing people because they identify as LGBT is somehow following the words of Jesus, because there's no way you can convince me that that was for the good of creation, for the good of God, for the good in any way, shape, or form following what Jesus says.
Yeah. So if your news sources and the things that the music that you're listening to and the shows and whatever, etc., all the media that you consume, when you hear language or encounter language that would demonize the other a group of people,
Mm-hmm.
That would lose sight of the fact that all humans have been created in the image of God. When you encounter that, red flags need to go up.
Yeah.
I think that's part of the problem, is that we have folks who, part of what leads to the problem of camps, right, of a bipartisan, bifurcated world, is that we're at least within the church and their Judeo-Christian tradition, and I will actually say the Abrahamic faith all teach that same lesson.
Mm-hmm.
Or assert that all humans are created in the image of God.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're consuming or taking in news sources that do not reflect that, then it is your responsibility to raise a red flag and say, hold on a second.
Yeah.
We are not allowed, by our very tenet of our faith, we are not allowed to think of humans who are on the other side of the aisle or who do things that we don't agree with, or blah, 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 you fill in the blank, to be described that way.
Yeah.
That this statement that all the rendering to God the things that are God's is all encompassing. To pay God's tax, or to give back to God what is God's, is to give our whole entire heart
Mm-hmm.
to our fellow neighbor and to God, to love God and neighbor with our muchness. You know?
I do. Well, at least I try to. Right? Is that the big?
Right.
Well,
by God's grace,
yeah.
It happens in spite of ourselves.
Yeah. It's a tough challenge, right? Because I think no matter where you're at on the political spectrum these days, at least within the United States, right, there's always someone who is the bad guy.
Mm-hmm.
And so who my media outlet says is the bad guy might be different than someone else's who says that I'm the bad guy, right? And so it's how do we find God and grace and compassion and that image of God in the midst of that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, barely.
And I think that's the big question and the big challenge for all of us. Well, thank you, Pastor Brad, for this great conversation. And
well, I hope it was a good conversation.
Continuing every day to challenge us and challenge what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And I think that's what we do here is we ask the tough questions and we explore the hard things, and hopefully it helps us to deepen our faith from a true and authentic way. And it's not blind faith, right? Like it's something we put a lot of effort into.
Yeah. This is a watershed. We live in a watershed time, you know, where there's a lot more that I feel that's in the balance than, and I'm just a white cis straight male saying that. I most of my life I can blithely go through and not feel threatened.
Yeah.
We see that this is a watershed moment, and it is now time to show up,
Yeah. Yeah.
to show up with God's love.
Amen to that. All right. Well,
Yeah.
thank you again. For our listeners out there, remember you can look below in the show notes, the comments section, not the comment. It's like the show notes or like the caption, that info that comes with each episode. You can find discussion questions for your Bible studies, small groups, and other conversations that you want to have. And remember, you can learn more about the podcast at 10footpolepodcast.com and find us on Facebook and Instagram at 10footpole podcast and wherever you listen to podcasts. And remember, the 10-Foot Pole podcast is a ministry of the Delaware Maryland Synod. To learn more, go to dmdsynod.org. Take care.